Okay, we'll give it one more minute. Welcome, everybody, to this month's webinar. I'm Ellen Ermer, and I'm one of the organizers of the monthly Lean Enterprise Division webinars, as well as Manny Beloso. The webinar today is a story about stories, actually, a book called Bending Granite, and these are stories about change. And we have two of the folks that put this book together, sharing a couple of these stories, and hopefully getting some interaction for you on your experiences with change and improvement also. They will share some of those stories, and then we're going to ask for some of your participation. They'll ask some questions, and if you can put your answers in the chat.
It's a pleasure to be with you. And we decided to just start off with a bang by starting with a story from the book. And then after that, we'll talk more about the book itself. But I think it'd be great for you to kind of be thinking about, as I share this story, kind of what struck you about it, or what kind of things have happened in your world that may resonate in relationship to this particular story. The context for this story was that I was working at the University of Wisconsin Engineering School, where we were working on improving addiction centers and mental health facilities around the country, and looking at ways to reduce, to retain people in care and reduce recidivism. And so this story is one of the experiences, and I'll get right into it. So think about what struck you about it, or anything that it may have triggered in terms of resonating with you. So let me just read some of I'm not reading the whole story. I'm reading pieces of it that I think hold together well for a conversation. Did you say he threatened to kill himself? Yes, he just told me he had enough and wanted me to open the gun safe so he could get his rifle. I told him I wouldn't do it, but he's very agitated and says he will find a way into the safe. I'm worried for my family. That was the beginning of the call I made to the intake specialist at our local mental health facility. Our 23-year-old nephew, Brian, was living in a bedroom above our garage after his parents had thrown him out. He was an avid hunter, but I had secured his gun as I required as part of his moving in with us. Brian had numerous run-ins with the law and suffered from a number of mental health issues, including depression and attention deficit disorder. After the intake specialist ran through the suicide protocol for me, she recommended I bring him in immediately. We both were concerned he might harm my wife and my family. Fortunately, this was only a fictitious scenario my colleague and I had developed for experiencing how clients were treated at one of our city's oldest mental health providers. We called it a walkthrough, and doing one is the first thing we require of every member of any team in any organization looking at improving the quality of their service. We need them to appreciate firsthand at that specific time what it's like to be a client. Once Brian and I got into the reception area, we had to figure out how we let someone know we were there. Brian pointed to a glass window across the room with a round hole in it. The lighting behind the window was so dark, it was hard to see if anyone was even sitting behind it. The only directions were an old sign with black lettering on a blue piece of paper right below the window that said, "If you have been here more than 30 minutes, inform the receptionist." That sight raised a red flag in my brain that we were going to be there for a while, and we hadn't even checked in yet. After 30 minutes, I went back up to the hole, peeked in, and asked how much longer it's going to be. I tried to whisper to her that Brian was getting agitated. She said, "Do you see all those other people? They have stories too. We are down to 2 staff and we are working as fast as we can. Now go sit down." 50 minutes after we had first got up to the window, the lady behind the glass with the hole in it said she had talked to the intake specialist and moved our mental health assessment with a counselor up, and it looked like we would probably be seen in the next half hour. I looked at my nephew. I could tell it was too late. He shook his head to let me know he couldn't stay there any longer. I understood it, and we walked back out through the construction noise and got in our car. The next day, we met with the executive director of the facility we had just visited. While our experience was fresh, we described our experiencing step by step from the phone conversation with the intake specialist to arrival at the facility to the encounter of looking through the round hole in the glass with the receptionist, to the experience with the drug dealer, to our final exit without getting service, or even a pleasant goodbye. During what they all thought was real, life and death emergency. He just sat there in shock. Thanks for listening. Any observations or anything that struck you about this? Anyone?
So again, if you can put your observations in the chat, I can go ahead and communicate those and we can have somewhat of a conversation.
While we're waiting for that, Tom, I hear that story and I've read it several times, and it's so consistent with experiences I think that people have, that when they walk through their process and then they communicate what they discovered, people are surprised. It's like, wow, didn't see that coming.
Yeah, that was one of the critical things we taught anybody we worked with, that we wanted them to walk through and be in the shoes of the people who use their service. And a lot of them didn't want to do it because they knew it would be hard to deal with what they were going to observe. But others were courageous enough to do it and say, oh my goodness, we should be doing this so much better.
Couple of the folks are just making, some comments about more about the description of our healthcare system being understaffed and overworked. Some comments about visiting a hospital a day. Sometimes care providers see their time as more valuable than the patient's. And someone said a sign that if you've waited 30 minutes in a crisis situation, there should be immediate assistance available. But I think your point again was the folks that are working in that system or in charge of that system need to get out there and see this and understand and feel it and be a part of it to start to make the right changes.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever good for people that are very, very busy today in a healthcare system that's overwhelmed to be engaged in non-value added activity either. Yeah. And I mean, I think if you I'm guessing that when you bring staff together after this is done, Tom, that one of the things that's said, what would you like to see happen? What should have been happening there when we stepped into that waiting room? And they can tell you, right, Tom?
Absolutely, absolutely. And just to end this story so we can keep on rolling, I mean, I want to reinforce to all of the people listening the power of walking through the process, actually experiencing it. Next best thing is obviously flow charting it or creating some kind of way of doing it, so that, you get a feel for that particular process. But what we found is that the counselors in the back were only being utilized about half of the time because the people would not show up to actually come there, because the word was out that this was a place that was not welcoming. The signage was bad. I mean, there was they treated you bad. If you brought anything in, they would look through your belongings. So people didn't show up, much less try and improve the system. So we really had an opportunity there, and they became a lot better as a result of slowly working on different pieces of that process. So we don't do it as a punitive effort. It's a way of getting at the opening up of the possibility for change.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think the action, somebody asked, what kind of improvement did you take based on this walkthrough analysis that you did? And
Better lighting, better signage to get in. You didn't hear the whole story, so we were lost even getting to the darn place.
Mm.
Better signage, better welcoming, not a hole in the wall with a dark where you didn't know who was there, but lighting it up, painting the lobby, having somebody welcome you and say, God, we're glad to have you here today. How can we help? Right? I mean, all of those things, there were like 5, 6 immediate small things that made a big difference to the process that were not resource intense.
yeah, and it's not, I think people, I saw a comment, not enough people, but actually they had enough people, didn't they? They didn't need, they had a fire going. They didn't need more hoses,
They
is
did
what he was
not need
saying.
more hoses. They needed to reorient the system.
I like that. And I like you talk about some of these, what we might term as simple solutions, but oftentimes those can be so instrumental in making a difference. So, you don't want to negate that. Definitely look for that.
I
Well,
think
thank
that's
you.
something in the book too, Ellen. When we get to the talking about the book, that a lot of the stories that are told, the improvements are simple and elegant,
Hmm.
and make big you know give us big results.
Hmm.
So okay.
Tim, why don't you talk about the book?
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. I just want to welcome everybody that came on. We started right away with Tom with a story, and we just want to thank you for taking your lunch break with us. We want to thank Ellen and Manny for organizing this and inviting us to participate. We're talking today about our book, Bending Granite. So let me tell you a little bit about the book. So, the concept of bending granite defies the laws of physics, but not the limits of our imagination. And wouldn't you know, just as I start to talk, my phone goes off, but I'll turn it off here. There we go. All right. It's probably a political call anyway. So the concept of bending granite defies the laws of physics, but not the limits of our imagination. Granite is rock. It's hard, it's solid, tough, resistant to change. Like granite, many of our most durable institutions today are designed not to bend easily either, but rather to do the same thing over and over in predictable and orderly ways. Just like some of the things in Tom's story, they were just doing it in predictable, orderly ways. Most, if not all of you, know pretty much what I'm talking about. As I suspect, you're leading change as part of your job or volunteer responsibilities, probably tackling seemingly unbendable challenges in a wide range of fields and situations. As all veterans of challenging change management situations, the authors in our book, over time, they developed some significant amount of scar tissue making change. But with the pain and the struggle that came came the glory of accomplishment, seeing their organizations change for the better of their customers, their stakeholders, and their employees. Bending Granite is a collection of true stories by different makers who were passionate about their organizations. They knew that they had to persistently and patiently nudge their organizations forward day by day, one improvement at a time. There was no big bang, no instant pudding, no quick fixes. It's only through the steady drip, drip, drip on their individual pieces of granite that they were able to shape but not break the organizations that they love. We decided to use stories as a tool for helping people in our book so that they just didn't hear the nuts and bolts of quality and lean and Six Sigma, but to hear stories that would help them understand more deeply what was really meant in making change and what it takes to realize results. Bending Granite offers 30 true stories by 30 authors in 30 organizations over 3 decades, all in the Madison area. As compilers of these stories, we chose to develop kind of a theoretical model of purpose, process, and people for each of the authors to use and focus when they did their writing in the book. And within this framework, there's a lot of sub-themes such as metrics, cultures, leadership, systems, and more. I think reading our book, you'll find many lessons within each of the stories. But enough about the book. Let me dive into some more of the stories. How's that? I'd like to share our next story. It's a story by Michael Williamson. It's Never Waste a Crisis. One of the things we do on our website, which we'll talk about later, is we do a podcast. So this is actually an outtake of an upcoming Bending Granite podcast. And we like to do it so you'll hear it in his voice. I think you'll really enjoy hearing Michael's soothing Southern accent. And again, as you listen, think about what struck you. What memories did it evoke about the work that you do and the lessons that you've learned? And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion again after this story. Give me a couple seconds and I'll do a little transitioning here to the story to get it on the from the podcast. I'm going to share a little bit here. You're making me coordinate some technology here. How's that? Oh, I think I have to, hang on. Let me, oh, here, I can do it this way. Okay, sorry, just a second. There we go. I'll get it started, the story. This is Michael Williamson, Never Waste a Crisis.
Things were bad. They were really bad at the city of Madison in 1983. Good working equipment was hard to come by. If you were the chief of police and you couldn't get officers on the street because your squad cars were sitting at the city garage, it was a problem. If you were the public works director and it was peak park season and you couldn't get the parks mowed in a timely manner because your gang mowers were broken down, it was a problem. The same thing with public works, the same things with the streets department, with the forestry crews, the list went on. So what was the problem? Well, vehicles and equipment were sitting at the staging lot in the city's First Street garage for days before a mechanic could even look at them, let alone determine what the problem was, get them fixed and back on the road again. The light was quickly thrown on the mechanics. I mean, after all, they were union mechanics. So they had to be at least part of the problem, if not all of it. So solutions started flying. Fire some of the lazy mechanics and the rest of them will work harder. Contract out their work to the private sector because you know the private sector is much more efficient than the public sector. Give them more positions so they can handle the backlog. Lesson number one, for every complex problem, there's a simple answer, and it's almost always wrong. You know how this works. Something comes up in the organization, people start throwing out ideas, not based upon any data, it's just impulse. I call it grasping at straws. But this time it was different. The mayor, Joe Sensenbrenner, had just been down to the UW-Madison for a 2-day seminar by a guy by the name W. Edwards Deming. And there he had heard these examples about how the Japanese were transforming their manufacturing process. And so he came back and he thought there must be a different and better way to look at this situation using these new techniques he just heard about. The problem was there was no examples in the public sector. All we had was translations of Japanese industrial models. Lesson number 2, never waste a crisis. So we decided to apply these new techniques because this was a crisis. And you never waste a crisis if you want to drive change in an organization. It's your best way to alter the status quo. enter faculty from the UW-Madison, and specifically a guy by the name of Bill Hunter. He was a white shirt, black tie wearing guy, educated at Princeton, and now he was on the esteemed faculty of the statistics faculty at UW. Lesson number 3, the 85-15 rule is alive and well. Now, Professor Hunter agreed to work with us on our initial process improvement team, and he understood the 85-15 rule. You know, those of you who are familiar with it, but 15% of the improvement opportunities rest in the hand of the workers, 85% rest with management. So Professor Hunter asked to meet the workers, the mechanics, where they were, trapped in a process with which they had little control. So we took him there, and he made his pitch that they would work together to study and improve the process by using the new technique. Terry Holmes was the president of the union, and he responded to Bill. He said, "You are not telling us anything new. We understand what you're saying. The system is broken, and they are blaming us. Do you think you and this new idea can help us?" Lesson number 4, in God we trust, all others must bring data, and the data will set you free. So we created our first process improvement team, and we empowered the employees and the members to go out and to collect data on the process. And what we got back was pretty surprising. First of all, equipment was being kept online much longer than it had been in the past. A decade ago, equipment was replaced every 10 years. Now it was being replaced every 21 years. Our equipment was all purchased on low bid. We were a public agency, so we used low bid. But what that meant is we bought the cheapest product every time. There was no consistency in terms of manufacturers, in terms of models. We just got the cheapest product each time. And it was impossible to keep parts for all these different types of equipment. Each had to be ordered itself every time something broke. But most surprising was the time it took to get the purchasing requests approved. And we found out that it took 28 steps to purchase a part, and the longest period of time was resting in City Hall with the city comptroller's office waiting for them to approve the purchase of the part. Lesson number 5, tirelessly watch for unnecessary approval steps that slow down processes. Something breaks and new steps are added. We all know how this works. The process gets longer, it gets more cumbersome, and it never gets looked at in its entirety. Extra steps and complexity grinds down the process. But with study and data now, recommendations for improvement at the city garage were getting clearer. Team recommended adopting a more effective replacement schedule. City mechanics should work with their customers to determine what were the primary and priority pieces of equipment that needed to get back on the street and work on those first. And finally, purchasing decisions were delegated to the managers at the garage. So how did things turn out, you might ask? Well, repair time dropped from an average of 9.5 days to 48 hours. The purchasing steps went from 28 down to 7. And rather than increasing costs by hiring more mechanics, annual savings from the new improvements generated an estimated $750,000 in savings. The outcome, the First Street Garage and their team became famous. They made it into Deming's next book. Professor Hunter and Terry Holmes traveled the country to share their story. They even presented at Ford Motor Company. Now, fancy that. The private sector learning something from the public sector. And most important, quality management had been birthed in the city of Madison. We became the first governmental body to apply its principles in the country and, to the best of our knowledge, anywhere else in the world. What a shame it would have been to waste a crisis. Now, there is an epilogue to this story. because the bond between Bill Hunter and the mechanics at the garage was more than professional. It became personal. So when Bill Hunter died from cancer at the much too early age of 49, the two head mechanics requested to pay their final respects in a special way to a man who believed in them. Their request was honored, and before he was buried, Terry Holmes and Joe Turner dug by hand the grave that was to hold Professor Bill Hunter's body.
And the music goes on.
Mhm.
It's a good story. I had to leave the last part on to the story because I thought it was such a good epilogue to the story that Michael Williamson tells. I just want to make one note is that Tom Mosgaller was part of that process too and knows that intimately as one of the originators of that project. So thoughts, comments?
I love this comment. I'm not supposed to cry at an ASQ webinar. It was amazing.
Oh, thanks.
It's a powerful story. It's a powerful story. And the mechanics were, a lot of them were part of the Harley Riders group here in Madison.
Oh,
And
really?
escorted Bill Hunter's coffin up to his hometown where he was buried. It was a deep emotional effect.
Well, again, it speaks so strongly to the importance of, he engaged the folks doing the work right from the get-go, right? Your
It
first
is.
slide, walking in their shoes and engaging the folks doing the work. And I've just found, at least in my too many years of doing this, when that's done, it's the most impactful. It really allows for, I think, the most change, the best change, and changes for the right reasons too. That's the other thing. I think it gives you that incentive maybe, or that platform for change. And it can be very, very helpful from that perspective.
Yep.
Does anybody else have comments they want to share? If they experienced this themselves, or are they attempting to try to bring this kind of approach into their organizations? What speaks to you? Besides getting sad, that isn't our intent at these webinars, but
Yeah, no, we didn't mean to bring you way down. It was just a good kind of a delightful story about that. I love the story because it has all of the elements of people getting together to fix stuff. And the first thing they come up with is a bunch of stuff about how we got to fix the people. And then a lot of the changes they're making is just how we can add more steps to the process, not less. So it's kind of classical in that sense. And then when they get into doing some analysis and they started applying, and by the way, they're applying these tools in like 1983, 84.
yeah.
This
yeah.
isn't, they're not talking about Womack now. He wasn't, I don't think his book came out till 90. Now I might be wrong on that, but I think it's about 1990.
Yeah.
And so I've been around for doing this stuff too since the early 80s. So I remember this. We were bringing people together with tools and techniques that, we think of it, it's been around and you guys have all seen it and da-da-da-da, but it was not there then.
Mm-hmm.
And part of why we wrote the book was to share what we consider to be timeless and universal tools that can go back thousands of years. People used it to today and for the next generation. So the book was really written for the next generation to give change agents hope that these same tools will be as useful then as they were in the past, as they were when we practiced and continue to practice.
Tom, you and I, we're out there talking to people all the time, and little things, and they'll be asking us some sort of thing about something they're working on. We'll say, well, you ever heard of like PDCA? And you guys may think that that's a universal language. It's not. You start saying PDCA, and they go, wow, how can I learn more about that? And they still have that.
Yeah, I'm working on 3 large systems changes right now. One is with young teachers. We lose a third of our young teachers in the first year. And we lose about 40% within the first 5 years. You can't run a good system when you have that kind of turn in the classrooms across the country. And so I'm teaching them the PDSA cycle, so that teachers are empowered in their classroom to do small incremental improvements over and over. And it's helping with retention. This is a pilot test, 2 years, to see if we can actually help them learn quality tools to help them feel more empowered to want to stay in the classroom. And it's a powerful opportunity to actually, it's really empowering because each of them is to work on one small thing this year. How they run parent teachers meetings, how they interrelate with the janitorial staff, whatever it is. But it's powerful. It's very powerful and hopeful. So whoever's on this webinar, don't look lightly the power you have and your ability to make a difference.
And those absolutely foundational methods, tools, and ways, as you say, they're just tried and true.
Yep.
And we have to keep reminding people and bringing that up and teaching people about those. So thank
James,
you.
you got another story?
I do.
Yep.
Yeah, my final comment is just stay as much as you can with the basics. Don't, Dave Gustafson is one of our authors from the University of Wisconsin Engineering Department. He always says, I love it. He always says, don't complexify it, which is a complex way of saying don't make it simple, but I like it. Anyway, I'll get to our next story. How's that? Let's keep them rolling because that's what we do. That's what our book is really about. The next story is by Kathleen Paris. Again, I'm going to do it in her voice and part of our podcast. So we're kind of promoting our podcast at the same time here.
This is my favorite story, Tim. This is my favorite story.
I'm one of mine too. I just love when you listen to podcasts. She visits. It's actually, this one is posted. This is an old podcast, so you can go and listen to it anytime. And Kathleen is an author herself and an international consultant, really, in quality improvement activity and planning and strategy and those sorts of things. And Kathleen also served as their primary editor on Bending Granite. So again, as you're listening to it, think about your reaction, what struck you, and don't be afraid to chat. I see some great chats out there and I'm reading them, so I appreciate you doing that. So give me a second here and I'll bring it up. It just takes me, it's like old guys trying to master technology here. So you got to give me a second. I'll get the next one. And here it is. It's called, she'll introduce it, I think.
Disaster at the Ritzy Restaurant by Kathleen A. Paris. That we are interdependent at work was a lesson I learned from Andy, the dishwasher. During college, I worked as a server in a fancy hotel with an even fancier dining room. Guests at this dining room were treated to meals cooked right at their tables. My job was to make fresh Caesar salads and cook flaming steak Diane, bananas Foster, cherries Jubilee, and other lusciously dramatic dishes. Andy, not his real name, was a developmentally challenged adult from a nearby institution whose job was to wash dishes for the dining room. He was enthusiastic about his dishwashing job, showed up in freshly laundered whites every day, always on time. To anyone's memory, Andy had never missed a shift in the years he'd been there. He would stop you in the kitchen and ask how things were going. Were the dishes as clean as you wanted, Miss Paris? Are you happy with my work? People secretly smirked that Andy cared so much about his humble job of dishwashing. How awful is that? One Saturday night, Andy didn't show up for work. No one had even noticed until the dishes started piling up. I hope I can adequately describe the disaster. Those of us who were servers on this busy night were actually washing dishes for our own tables. Naturally, our dishwashing meant less time to take care of our very discriminating customers. People waited for their food while we hunted for clean soup bowls. The shrimp cocktails edged from crispness to limpness while we scoured dirty trays hunting for cocktail forks to wash. I staggered out at closing time, exhausted, undertipped, of course, because our service hadn't been up to par, and dismayed at the pile of dishes that remained to be done by someone else. I never knew who cleaned up that mountain of dishes that night, but I know that the next time I saw Andy at his post, washing away with his smile intact, I was grateful. I realized in a very concrete way that the dishwasher and I needed each other to be successful. And this is what a successful organization requires, recognizing that we need others in order to be successful ourselves.
Tom, you want to lead us in a little, your thoughts about this? And what your
I mean, I
favorites?
think the question I want to raise with people listening in is, you know, what struck you about that? About how oftentimes we work in places where we forget the importance of people upstream and downstream, that it takes a whole team to make things happen. And, you know, Andy was just such a critical part of that, and no one was appreciative of the kind of gift he brought to that place, not just in what he did, but also the culture he created by his behavior.
Mhm.
This story to me is one of the best examples of systems thinking.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I think when we think of systems thinking, when we think of systems, we think of all of the different components of some sort of parts and like the different operations within a hospital. I worked in healthcare for 30 years. So, you know, it's all the different parts coming together. But this is systems thinking on really a much higher, deeper level. And that is the system of people, the system of process, right? And people, process, people, and purpose, and their purpose. So those three systems coming together, this story really is it's short, but it's powerful.
Mhm. Couple good comments here. I don't know if you're seeing them, but right, the focus on internal customers, that's you know, the folks we work with, the people upstream and downstream are our customers also. That we need as organizations, again, to tear those silos down. Again, look at them as a system, to your point.
I
And
love that comment.
so,
I love the comment. Even small
yeah,
gears in
gears in the
Rolex
Rolex are important.
Yeah, that's a really good one. You know, I think this is just kind of a thing for people that work in the field of quality, and that is, you know, you think of the big improvements that you make and the things you talk about, the successes of some process or some steps that you removed and costs that you took away. But what is the real impact that you've made on individuals in the process? Not by the changes you made, but by including them and just you personally made on them individually.
And I've had the most satisfaction from that. I've had people thank me personally for that, and I think, oh, I mean, I didn't, you know, it didn't dawn on me not to do it, but it was nice to see that it was recognized, and actually that really fulfilled my goals than anything else around where I wanted to go. I'll never forget when a woman in a healthcare world came up to me and said, every time there's complete chaos and things going on, I always say, oh, I know you're here to come and work with us and help us figure this out. It's like, oh, okay. I never feel like I get very far, but at least I'm trying.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
a side story in that motor equipment one by Williamson that relates to this story. That's not in the book, but I think is very powerful, is when we went down to get the mechanics to actually consider looking at the process, they didn't want to. I mean, they didn't trust anybody who was going to start digging around in their stuff. Right? And so the first thing out of their mouth was, you know, before you look at the process, clean the damn windows here in motor equipment so that we can see inside the vehicles. And so Terry Holmes took me down and others, and we looked inside and we had little, trying to save money, little light bulbs hanging above where they were supposed to work on the engines. And the windows probably had 10 years of grease and oil on them. And
Yeah.
they said, you get that cleaned up, and then we can talk about how we buy parts. And so within 24 hours, we had a crew down there, cleaned all the windows, got better lighting over the engines, and then they were willing to talk. But you got to earn the trust of the people
Yep.
closest to the work. If you don't
Yep.
earn the trust, they're not gonna be part of trying to be part of the solution.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Again, a good story of some early 5S before we knew what 5S was. All right. All right. I'm going to get us move us on. How's that sound, Tom?
That sounds
Sounds
great.
good.
Yeah.
I'm going to get us to our final story. This is a really good story. This is a guy who's been around. He's owned a couple of his own manufacturing firms, and it's a story by Dave Boyer, an independent businessman in the Madison area, and been very involved in a number of boards and whatever, and is always promoted in healthcare and all sorts of industry. Quality improvement was a big influence in what we did with the Madison Area Quality Improvement Network, McKinn, back in the day. This is an outtake of an upcoming podcast. So this is going to be coming up. You get a chance to hear a little bit more from Dave on that podcast. So look to that. Again, tell us what strikes you about this. And if you give me a second, I'll get that going. Let's see. Trouble with Ant Bait is a story by Dave Boyer. Dave has been a CEO for a number of manufacturing firms in Madison, Wisconsin. He serves on a number of boards and was a board member of the Madison Area Quality Improvement Network. All the stories in our book start with a quote. Dave begins his with, "Every process is perfectly designed to get the results it gets," by Arthur Jones. Now, to be honest, this quote has been attributed to a wide range of people, including George Box, a statistician at the University of Wisconsin, Dr. Edward Deming himself, Don Berwick, Paul Batalden at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. Regardless of the source, it's a pretty good quote. So here's a reading from Dave's story, Trouble with Ant Bait. They were deadly to ants, all right, but we had a problem. You've probably seen the SC Johnson Raid brand ant baits, little plastic houses with cubes inside of something that ants find delicious, though deadly. At my company, Playcon, we produce millions of units of ant bait traps for the SC Johnson Company. We had built a 30,000 square foot building just for them. Then one day, the shift supervisor brought me the bad news. We are seeing a 5% defect rate on our ant bait cubes because of size variation. Some of them are a lot bigger and some are smaller than they should be. I asked what this meant practically. The supervisor explained, well, if the cubes are too big, they don't fit in the plastic containers and we have to throw them out. It's money lost to us. And if they're too small, the amount of toxins may not be enough to kill ants, or else the bait traps won't last as long as we say they do, and therefore people will buy our competition's traps. That's also money lost to us. Now he had my attention. What do you think is causing the variation? I asked. No idea, he shrugged. Enter quality improvement. Working with consultant Brian Joyner, I convened a problem-solving team of line workers and the shift supervisors to get at the critical issues of poison pellet size. The first thing Brian did was show every worker how to measure variability by using control charts. This empowered everyone working on the product to measure variability themselves versus having a separate inspection process done by someone else, somewhere else, and at another time. Team brainstormed what could possibly be causing the unacceptable variation. One idea was that it could be an issue of allowing varying amounts of moisture in the material. Team tested their hypothesis about moisture levels, but we learned that moisture was unequivocally not the problem. The team then looked at mechanical variables and noted that two machines operated simultaneously. An extrusion machine that produced a four-sided ribbon of clay-like material and a knife that cut the ribbon into cubes. A team member wondered out loud if these two machines might be out of sync with each other. An obvious question that none of us had thought to answer earlier. The line workers measured the revolutions per minute, RPM, of each machine and found that they were, in fact, running at different speeds. If the extruder was running faster than the knife, the cubes were too big. If the knife was running faster than the extruder, the cubes were too small. When the RPMs of both machines were synced up, the cubes were just the right size. It was a Goldilocks and Three Bears kind of moment. The team members presented their findings to the company leadership team, and a fix was adopted for all three shifts. The reject rate was reduced from 5% to less than 1%. This was a huge cost savings, customer pleasing improvement. And it happened precisely, pun intended, because we asked the people closest to the work to improve the process. Relationship diagrams and systems thinking are another set of principles and tools that are core to the quality movement. We can use these tools to map out processes and relationships to discover the best leveraged way to impact the entire system. At PlayCon, for example, we drew a relationship diagram of the sales process to determine which factors in our process were most likely to positively impact customer satisfaction, sales results, and profits. It turns out the most positive thing our team could do is to interview potential clients without trying to sell them a thing. Instead, we asked them what problems they were trying to solve, what goals they had, what worried them the most. The second most positive thing that correlated to results was to bring teams together to create solutions from our existing products and services that would help solve our customers' current issues. Our goal was to knock customer socks off with solutions we were then able to present to them. I'm telling you, this selling system worked brilliantly. The approach is the opposite of the most universally accepted sales techniques. Here's what I have to sell. Do you want to buy some? We had identified a real leverage point by mapping out a new selling system. An enduring principle for me is that you get what you measure. In the plastic packaging companies where I worked, we learned that if you simply measure the speed of packages produced per hour on a machine, the hourly totals of packages increase. But it was along with defects and the potential of having to quarantine entire skids of product for inspection. Win, loss. But when we measured variation of key process inputs, like plastic thickness, temperature, and speed, and worked to reduce that variation, then output increased along with product quality. Win, win. So, three timeless quality principles I've learned the hard way are these. Recognize that every process is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. Find leverage points through systems thinking. Accept that how you measure is what you measure. These principles corrected my earlier academic education and have helped me bring a much more powerful perspective to the world of design possibilities. The movement to total quality was a revolution. It was a necessary revolution in many industries, and it brought significant value and quality of life to our entire country. I think the principles and tools I used during my career are timeless and are still applicable to the major problems we are trying to solve in our world today. Total quality ain't just for ants. All right. So that was our final story for today, but we're interested in your thoughts. And that was kind of more traditional manufacturing for me. There's three big lessons there. So I'd be interested in your thoughts and your comments.
Couple chats here. You've probably seen lots of people agreeing with the participants, many of the comments coming from you, the stories. Um, lots of energy and positive comments around what's being presented today. I think a lot of agreement.
Tom, can you think of some key themes that we see across the stories that come out even in this story and the three that we've already given?
Well, I think each story kind of amplifies certain elements of what we consider critical to being effective change agent with a set of quality principles and practices. I think the whole idea of being in the shoes of the people is, just got to do it. I mean, every month I would get on a plane and go somewhere in this country and have to do a walkthrough so I could see what it was like. It kept me humble rather than sitting in the engineering school thinking I could map out what was the right answers for people thousands of miles away. You had to go and be on the ground and walk among shoes. So the concept of walkthrough is just so critical to me. And then I think, Michael's story is just self-evident, the absolute essential, number one, of creating a culture where people are open to improvement, that there's a willingness to do it. And then secondly, once you flow chart and pictorially display something, so it's evident, actually get people to be willing. And the comptroller's office, by the way, which controlled about a third to a half of those steps because it didn't trust the mechanics to make the right decision. So it went uptown 2 miles away to somebody who didn't know a fan belt from a generator was making decisions about things that just insulted the mechanics. And so to get them to buy in, even when we flow charted and say, why do you have this step in there? Oftentimes it was put in there 10 years ago for some stupid thing that had no relevance to today's system. So that whole idea of making evident which is below the water line is so critical. And then Kathleen's thing about everybody being important in a system of delivering a service or a product. Those three things to me just stand out in this as critical. So it's the purpose, it's being clear on your purpose, being clear on the processes you have, and how you treat your people in order to get that to happen. Because if you don't treat your people right, you're not going to get the truth. They're going to create workarounds rather than being forthright.
Well, I really appreciate the comments that have come across, the stuff about thinking of applying improvement just to big and important problems and not to everything that we can do. I mean, it may seem mundane as ant bait, but when that's what you create, ant bait, that's pretty important. And then I saw another comment in there about sometimes indicate, we can apply TQM to everything as intricate as the space shuttle and to ant traps. So it applies all along the way. I have to say one quick thing before I kind of get to some closing comments, and that is that I remember when I worked in healthcare, our first projects were not about improving anything except how we checked. We were checkers checking how we checked. So I got a little story in the book about that. So anyway, look into that. I want to bring us to some close if I can. I just want to say, I'd like to invite you to come visit us at Bending Granite, one word, bendinggranite.org. Come visit us. We regularly share news stories, and as you can see, we're going to come out with season 2 of podcasts. There's going to be about 8-10 new podcasts. They'll come out weekly for a while. And if you like what you see and you hear, subscribe, and we'll update you, not as often as a lot of people update you. We'll maybe every 6 weeks, we'll send you an update. You can unsubscribe anytime, but we'll keep you up to date at some new stories and some new podcasts. And let me ask you a quick question while I've got you here. if you had a story to tell about change, what would your story be? And I challenge you to write your story, to tell your story. If you want some ideas on how to tell stories, listen to the podcast on storytellers. It's one of them on bendinggranite.org. We believe that telling stories is the best way to increase your understanding and other people's understanding of a concept. Write your stories, send them to us, and we'll give you some feedback. Just send them to us on bendinggranite.org. And if you want, we'll even post it. But we'll check before we do that. We won't post anything you send us, but we'll give you feedback. Anyway, that's our Bending Granite challenge. I hope you take the challenge. Write something, send it to us. We'll give you some feedback. If we like it, if you want, we'll post it. And if you want to get involved somehow in a podcast and you got a message to send there, we do that too. So we want to end kind of by thanking everyone. And it's really been a pleasure for us to be here. Tom?
Just to model the way, if any of you have any feedback for us about, spin the PDSA wheel for us and give us some feedback on how you like this as an approach that we have developed for sharing the story of quality with others. So if you get a chance, put something in that chat box that'll give us some feedback. What worked, what didn't today? What could we do better? Thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you.
Ellen.
Take care. Thanks,
Thanks
everybody,
again.
for joining. See you in November. Bye.